Hi guys, welcome back to Geometry. Today we've been looking at distance and midpoint. Now the first time we got together we talked about finding the distance between 2 points on a line segment, and all we had to do was subtract the values of those 2 points. We talked about finding the distance between 2 points on the coordinate plane, and we discussed the formula that we use for that based on the Pythagorean theorem. We worked through some examples, finding the distance between 2 points, both on a number line and on the coordinate plane. Then we got into what it means to be a midpoint. And the way that we find a midpoint on a number line is simply add those two values together and divide by 2. You're finding the average of those two values. Okay, then we talked about if you find the midpoint on a coordinate plane. Well, if you want the midpoint on a coordinate plane, you need an x value and a y value. So we add the x's together, divide by 2, add the y's together, divide by 2. We find the average of both x and y, and that'll give us the midpoint. And then finally, we talked about one more thing. We talked about how to find an endpoint given one endpoint and and the midpoint. And we talked about using a little bit of algebra to find that missing endpoint. Well, today we're going to take that algebra just one step further. Okay? Sometimes we are given algebraic expressions instead of values for the lengths of those segments. So in this case, we want to find BC if B is the midpoint of AC. Okay, well, first thing that we need to keep in mind is that when we don't have a bar on top of those letters, okay, when that bar is missing, that means the length of that segment. When we have the bar on top, they're talking about the actual segment itself, the geometric picture. But when we have no bar on top of it, no commas between those numbers, that is a number. That's talking about the length of that segment. So when you see the question that says find BC, we're talking about a length. We're talking about a distance. Now, the important thing we're given here is that B is the midpoint of AC. And if we go back to what it means to be a midpoint is the point in the halfway between the endpoints of a segment. If x is the midpoint of AB, that means that AX is congruent to XB, meaning the lengths of those segments are equal. So in this case, they're telling us that AB, the segment AB, is going to be congruent to segment BC, which means the length of those segments are equal. So the length of segment AB is equal to the length of segment BC. Now again, without that bar on top, they're talking about a number or a value or an expression. So the length of AB is this. It's the 4x minus 5. And the length of segment BC is this. Okay, it's the 11 plus 2x. So I know that those two values are going to be equal to one another. So I'll set them put them into this equation, 4x minus 5 and 11 plus 2x, and I'll set those equal to one another. And now, guys, we've got an algebraic equation that we should be able to solve. The first thing we've got to do is get all those x's onto one side. So I'm going to choose to move all of my x's over to the left. Okay? On the right side, 2x minus 2x cancels, and all that's left over here is the 11. On the left side, 4x minus 2x is 2x. Bring down that minus 5. Okay, now we've got ourselves a two-step algebra problem. We'll add 5 to both sides and have that 2x equals 16. Divide both sides by 2, and we'll have that x equals 8. Now, someone's going to circle that and say that's our final answer, but I got bad news for you guys. That's not the final answer. The directions didn't say to find x. The directions said to find BC. So, how do I find BC? Well, guys, good news. It's pretty simple. Once we have the value of x, we sub that into this expression in place of x for the length of BC. So that means for us, we can say the length of BC is 11 plus 2 times 8. Well, 2 times 8 is 16, and 11 plus 16 is going to be 27. So the length of segment BC is 27 units. Okay, so it looks kind of scary if we look at the original question, but it's really not so bad. Okay, they tell us that B is the midpoint. That means that these two halves of the segment are congruent to one another. So we set those expressions for those two halves of the segment equal to one another, and we solve for x. Once we have the value of x, we sub that into the expression and find the length of the segment. Now, one more detail that we can look at, and they'll throw this word out there every once in a while, a segment bisector. Okay, bisect. This word means to cut in half. Okay, so it's cutting the segment in half, which means it's going to intersect a segment at its midpoint. So when we look at this diagram and they want us to find the length of segment GT if line MO bisects segment GE. Well, if line MO bisects segment GE, what that means for us is this point T is the midpoint. So that means that these two segments are congruent to one another. So right away, I can write that down. Segment GT is congruent to segment TE. Okay, that's what it means to be a midpoint. You set two halves of the segment equal to one another. Well, we've got those two halves of the segment congruent, so now we can say that the lengths of those two segments are equal. So once again, take a look at that diagram. We have segment GT and we have segment TE. And we have those two segments equal to one another. So now we can take the expressions that represent those segments. So GT is 4x minus 6 and TE is 3x plus 1. And we can set those equal to one another. And then, then we can just solve for x. So we'll subtract 3x from both sides, get all our x's over here on the left, and 4x minus 3x is 1x, or just x, minus 6 equals 3x minus 3x cancels, and we just have 1. Okay, and then we can, they're subtracting 6, so we'll add 6 to both sides, and we'll get x equals 7. Now, we want to circle that and say that that's our final answer. But before we do, we should check. They want us to find GT. So they want us to find the length of that segment GT. Well, that's not so bad. We'll take what x is equal to, and we'll sub it in place of x in the expression for segment GT. So now we can say GT, try that again, there we go, GT is equal to 4 times 7 minus 6. So 4 times 7 is 28, minus 6, and GT is equal to 22 units. Okay, and once again, keep in mind when we don't have that bar or that line on top of those letters, that's referring to the length of that segment. Okay, so if we have the midpoint, okay, we can apply a little bit of algebra. We know that the midpoint cuts that segment in half, which means that those two halves of that segment have to be equal to one another. And that's what's going to allow us to set up this equation. And guys, always, always, always start with that algebra first. Before you sub in any variables, talk about what quantities you're saying are equal to one another. The length of segment AB is equal to the length of segment BC. Start with the diagram, build your equation from there. If you jump right ahead to the x's, you can run into some problems pretty easily. But if you start with the diagram, that's going to make your job a whole lot easier. Okay? So we can use that to solve for x, and the same thing happens if they talk about a segment bisector. A segment bisector does kind of the same thing a midpoint does. It cuts a segment in half. So the two halves of that segment created by that segment bisector are also going to be equal to one another. So we can use that to set up this equation where GT equals TE, sub in those expressions, and solve for x. Just keep in mind, guys, sometimes they want you to find x, sometimes they want you to find the length of a segment. So make sure you read the question carefully and answer the question that's asked. Okay, there's an assignment on Canvas. This video is posted to Canvas. If you have any questions, you can contact me through Canvas or you can send me an email. I look forward to hearing from you guys. Good luck.